Let me start my today's presentation with the example of a woman named Marianne Jarka, who had been a Red Cross surgery nurse during World War I in the Austro-Hungarian army. In the early 1960s, she started writing her autobiography. A large part of her memoirs deals with the time between early 1916 and the end of the war, when Jarka was stationed at several mobile military hospitals of the Southwestern Front. Here, she witnessed the consequences of industrial warfare for soldiers with all their horrors, an experience she apparently could never overcome. I quote, "Today I am 72 years old. Until I draw my last breath, the torn bodies will haunt me," she wrote. Towards the end of her autobiographical text, Jarka also discussed the issue of war remembrance during the difficult post-war years. As a single mother of 2 illegitimate children, she now had to scrape through life and was forced to do manual jobs. Her former war commitment, her medical expertise as a nurse, and the war decorations she had received no longer counted. Jarka recollects the public dispraise of her war mission, and I quote again, "I gave my war decorations to the milkwoman for a liter of milk. She gave them to her boys to play with." These 2 passages, as short as they are, insistently hint to what I will elaborate today, my approach to the history of female nursing during World War I starts with the assumption that these women indeed were confronted with the following contradiction. On the one hand, they often experienced the cruelty and barbarity of the Great War in close vicinity to the centers of violence and witnessed the suffering and dying of hundreds of thousands of soldiers with severe, incurable injuries. Whereas propaganda idealized the image of nurses and emphasized their strongly feminized, self-sacrificing roles as white angels, sisters or mothers of the male warriors. On the other hand, after 1918, in hardly any belligerent country, nurses' wartime experiences were publicly remembered and appreciated, apart from only a few exceptions in Great Britain and the United States. This is especially true for Austria-Hungary, where officers' war experiences dominated the official and hegemonic war narratives during the entire interwar period. Accordingly, war accounts not only of common soldiers, but also of all women who had participated in the war as trained or untrained nurses were rarely published and distributed after 1918, what turned my research into a quite difficult enterprise. Only a few such texts are available today, and the major part of them remained unpublished or was self-published after 1914. I have here, I can only very shortly show you my sources, and you see most of them are unpublished or self-published. The one of Ruda Evelyn is the only one which was published in the interview period. Here are 2 self-published texts, and here as well, and the one is published only in 1978, as you see. So these are my sources. All in all, these autobiographical writings represent a many-layered and rich corpus of texts which oscillate between definitely given apologetic tendencies or inscription into an at least partially heroizing war remembrance culture on the one hand, this also women did, and vivid realism or even war critiques on the other. They are similarly shaped by the fact that female nurses in many ways transgressed what was redefined or defined as women's fare in wartime. We thus have to discuss their narratives by emphasizing the tension of prescribed gender norms and antagonistic experiences. This becomes all the more clear by the fact that many war nurses were stationed directly behind or even in the midst of the battlefield, so that research has labeled their work rightly as frontline nursing. Before I come back to that, let me only very shortly hint to the topic of nurses in historical research. By doing so, I also want to emphasize some premises of my own still running research. Firstly, this research emanates from the given fact that war nurses were a necessity of modern warfare. Available figures for all belligerent countries prove tens of thousands of trained or untrained war nurses, and as such impressively underline their irreplaceable importance, indicating also the global character of World War I nursing. Secondly, and related to that, war nurses, whose commitment was also huge in World War II, became an iconic figure of the 20th century, as Christian Hallett has argued. This obviously was a female figure, as from the late 19th century onwards, nursing in general had been considered a genuinely female task. During the First World War, it became the ultimate proof of women's patriotism, advocated even by contemporary feminists. Research has examined the related gender discourses of social motherhood and femininity, and nursing in this respect was often seen as the equivalent of male soldiering with which women identified to a high degree. Such an idealization of the female war nurse and her tasks does not mean, thirdly, that the image of the war nurses was not rather ambivalent and also characterized by contradictions, be it regarding the devaluation and sexualization of these women, even in mainstream media during World War I. Fourthly, and that's the story I want to expand a bit now, the fact that war nurses indeed entered the field of military in many cases led to an experience of horror and traumatization. Only recently, historians have introduced the term of the second battlefield for medical staff's place of deployment in war hospitals, a term coined by the American novelist Mary Borden, who was a war nurse herself. With this notion, she described her and other nurses' work at the Western Front, where they as well fought a continuous battle against death and pain, often in vain. Margaret Hitchonette, therefore, has pleaded for an expanded history of World War I traumas by underlining the traumatic stress suffered by nurses and orderlies, as they often worked under conditions similar to those faced by combatants and repeatedly had to face men's mutilated bodies. Hitchonette, as well as the historian Santanu Das, therefore suggested to read written memoirs or diaries of war nurses as trauma narratives, with their rhetorical imagery and a fragmented and even surrealistic language of modernism, with what closely links them to the writings of shell-shocked soldiers. How do war accounts of nurses of the Austro-Hungarian army fit into these findings? In which ways do they refer to war violence and traumatization? And what are the specifics of these narratives? I will develop their example now by only mentioning the miserable state of the arts on the topic. Research literature on the medical system of the Austro-Hungarian army with its complex structure and its several reorganizations has mentioned or cited war nurses only rarely and casually. We even do not have any reliable figures on their number, also they must have been at least tens of thousands of women as in other countries. And I only can show you their quantity in form of pictures we collected in Vienna, so that you get an impression of the masses of nurses who went to the front. Yeah, so I go back now. You see, these are really, and they went to the front, or also they served in the hinterland, often in groups. Okay. The citation you find here is an example for, of course, also these women were driven by enthusiasm or at least acceptance of their task to go to the front. And I give you this example of a Bohemian war nurse. I went there following an irresistible inner drive with huge enthusiasm, fully aware of the severity of this step, with the holy resolution to dedicate all my strength to the service of the brave warriors who give their life and blood to protect our hearth and home. That seemed to me to be such a great duty, the more so as I was entirely free and therefore wanted to leave nursing in the hinterland to those who could not go away from home. Another nurse wrote that she wanted to directly participate in caring for the wounded in the field, to search for them immediately after the battle, and to apply the first emergency dressing, accompany those in need of help under a protecting roof. These are examples why the nurses wanted to go to the front and do frontline nursing there. And you can imagine that their motivation soon crashed with the reality of total war and industrialized warfare. And I bring you now some quotes, how their narratives developed. So, and we can speak here, and I go now a little bit away from. We can speak here also from a baptism of fire these nurses underwent, and they described in their text, and also processes of disillusionment. And this is also the topic I think we will see afterwards. I bring you again some quotes of the text from a Swiss nurse, Maria Pölnep-Flien, in the service of the Austro-Hungarian army. She described her baptism of fire as follows. Outside at the Sava, we for the first time saw the entrenchments where days ago the battle had raged. In the trenches, there were still guns and cartridges, pieces of shrapnel, linen and rags of clothes and cadavers of animals. We stared into the brown water of the Sava and heard the thundering and echoing of the guns in the distance. Horrible. We, the Swiss nurses, had already been completely cured of our enthusiasm of war, devastation, mutilated limbs, and blood. Oh, it was misery. Wherever you looked, day by day, the casualties came from the heights of the Kolubra. In the slaughterhouse, as we named the surgery, the bloody work went on without keys. And Marianne Jarka, and then the wagons with insured soldiers arrived, harnessed with 4 poor horses, 4 wounded men in each wagon. What a sad burden that was, friend and supposed enemies side by side, tormented with pain. And they were all young, so young. The churchyard, farmyards, the dairy farm with its corridors and open spaces, overcrowded in no time. The doctors in front of me chose the cases which had to come on the operating table immediately. I went around with the syringe of morphine, and then there was stitching up, amputations, skull and abdominal operations during the whole night, one after another, throughout the day and again at night, until all of them had been cared for poorly and hastily buried cared for or poorly and hastily buried under debris. This is a description which again reminds us of what has been said before about field hospitals and surgery units as second battlefield, where nurses, orderlies, and doctors had to fight and all often were defeated. Deciding on whom to help first and whom to count out as a hopeless case must have been traumatizing and surely evoked feelings of helplessness and guilt, all the more so in light of the absoluteness of physical pain. This, as Lance Carey has argued, is non-communicable and due to its unshareable, erects an insurmountable wall between the person who suffers from pain and the others. According to Carey's important study, physical pain also destroys language and only leaves anguished cries and noises. Another nurse therefore wrote, "There was pain and ache and screaming which drowned out everything." Or big transports with badly wounded persons had arrived overnight. In the course of 24 hours, we had taken in over 200 severely injured soldiers. The entire hospital, all officers, the entire hospital, all officers' rooms were filled to capacity. They lay head to foot in their corridors. We could hear groaning and clamor from all sides, an unspeakable misery. And that's my last example. I will not cite it again, that we have time for discussion. You can read it, and I come to the conclusion of my paper by summarizing the most striking and strong ambivalences which I found inscribed in the texts I analyzed in my research work. The first caused by the asymmetry of the hegemonic gender order. The first of these tensions was caused by the asymmetry of the hegemonic gender order and the growing ambivalence between the normative image of the nurse's femininity and female or motherly duties, including also, of course, the opposite, that is the alleged immorality and mere love, and mere love of adventure of those women who went to war, as it was said also. The tension between such pictures and their actual war commitment, and that was a tension they also had to react or to write against in their autobiographical texts. A second tension emerged between the nurses' patriotism and their belief that Austro-Hungary was involved in a necessary and defensive warfare against reckless enemies, and their growing ethical resentment against the war. This explains why some nurses even secretly, or not secretly, secretly, helped soldiers with self-inflicted injuries or wrote about their empathy with the enemy, what could not be elaborated in my paper, but would be an important and promising topic for future research. The preliminary findings that these tendencies seem to be stronger in unpublished or self-published war accounts should be investigated more closely by comparing various forms, dates of origin, and commemorative contexts of these texts. What I intended to show certainly was that nursing in World War I could indeed turn into a nightmare, but contrasted all tendencies of idealization. War violence, with its many dimensions, shaped and influenced nurses' bodies, emotions, and their mental condition, as their war accounts prove. These women indeed witnessed the horrible consequences of industrialized warfare with its continuous shelling, the millionfold killing and mutilating, gas attacks, and other war crimes. Nurses themselves became ill, had to bear deprivation, cold, lice, lack of sleep, extreme fatigue, and in many cases, the feeling of helplessness. All this surely was traumatizing and affected their life after the war, especially for those who could or did not want to continue professional nursing later on. This does not only apply to Marianne Jaaka, with whom my lecture started, but also to Agathe Fessler, to Pölnep Flynn. She remained to be a morphine addict after the war as well, and led a troubled life for many years. In summary, it can be said that the nurses' war accounts tell us much about the traumatization they developed during the war and related disintegration or silencing of what they had to witness and suffer during war. This was probably all the more true for former Austria, since the accounts of nurses were more or less completely repressed here after 1918. Although their commitment was officially acknowledged during the war, there was no public interest whatsoever in their experience in the post-war period. Isn't it time to integrate them, not at least to make clear that women as well were a prerequisite to lead the First World War? As it is, therefore, we cannot understand the First World War without integrating the analytical category gender into research. The history of war nurses is only one example for such a necessity. Thank you.